Right, so thanks very much for joining the session today. We're going to be talking about lightning out components on any platform. Unfortunately, there are many platforms, so we won't be covering them all. Sorry to disappoint. We will be focusing on Google Apps. I particularly like Google Apps platform because it's an app. It's a place people do work. They may sit in that app for several times. They might switch between Salesforce and Google Apps. And I wanted to tell a story about how we could improve that user experience instead of switching in and out between those two experiences, how we could use Lightning Out to streamline the user experience a little bit. So my name is Andy Fawcett. I'm Financial Force CTO. I'm also a Salesforce MVP. And I want to tell you a little bit briefly about Financial Force. Financial Force have been on the platform since 2009. We specialize in building native applications around the ERP segment. We have professional services automation, finance applications, human resource management applications, a new billing central application does subscription billing. Several investments we're looking to have several investments over the last few years, and our employees are growing rapidly. Our headquarters is here in San Francisco, though as you can tell from my accent, we also have offices in the UK, San Francisco, in Spain, as well as India. Customers give you a great idea of some of the sort of level of customers we're targeting and the number of countries with truly international delivery of software. So if you want to know a bit more about Financial Force, come and have a chat with me afterwards. We are actually recruiting. If you want to know more about our products, then you can stop by our stand in the expo and learn a little bit more about some of the exciting things we're doing. Perhaps if you wanted to understand a little bit about Einstein and where we're going with that, and also our new open source Echo integration. I don't know if many of you have used the Amazon Echo device. I personally am a massive fan of it. We've done a little bit of a proof of concept showing how we can control Salesforce products using that device. So some interesting things to see at the trade stand. Okay, let's get going with the agenda. We're going to take a look at components, containers, and events. And it's a bit of a preface of what really the architecture is of Lightning. And so I appreciate maybe some of you have done some Lightning, maybe others of you haven't. Kind of just a show of hands to give me an idea. How many of you have actually written a Lightning component? Excellent, good. The hands are going up much in greater quantities over the years. So good, we've got some Lightning app developers. So we're going to use some components to tell the story. We'll call them the address finder components. And there's two of them, and there's an interplay between the two of them which will become very useful in terms of separation of concerns, which helps us adopt Lightning Out easier than if we'd have perhaps considered a singular component. So we'll talk a little bit about how you can design your components to be more useful in different contexts as well. And to prove that point, we'll spend a bit of time looking at the components in Lightning Experience. It's a really exciting brand new container from Salesforce, and they're providing extensibility in Lightning Experience in much more extensive ways than we ever had with Classic, as Salesforce are calling it now. So I'm very excited about Lightning Experience. I'll probably talk to you twice as much time on that as well. Lightning Out is our main focus, so we'll take a look at that in a Google App context with those same components. So we'll see the components first in Lightning Experience, then we'll see the same components in Google Apps. And I went through a learning curve in how to get Lightning Out working in Google Apps. So I'll take you through some of that, show you some of the resources that I use, some of the gotchas that are involved in it. And so you can go away and you can try this stuff out for yourself and build some Google Addins. We'll be focusing on Google Docs in this case, but much of what I'm showing you applies to Google Spreadsheets, Google Forms, even the Gmail has its own add-in architecture. So you can consider this as an opportunity to think about how you can extend any of the Google suite of applications, not just Google Docs. And it's also some resources and QA we'll go through. So Lightning components are quite an abstract thing. What is a component? Well, it's a widget, okay? Well, what is a widget? Well, it's a box where you put things in that are useful, you want to reuse, okay? So we're getting somewhere. But really, it could be a very small building block for what you're building as a general user interface, but typically from an end user point of view, they tend to be very business, functional components that perform a task or help you perform a larger task. And those are the types of components we're talking about here. We're not talking about buttons or checkboxes. We're talking about business components. So we can see that we have the concept of a component lives inside a container. So components are nothing without containers. They've got to have something that will load the component. A component will be asked to display itself, and there are such things as components have events and they can communicate with one another. And that's a really important architectural decision, because when you're thinking about creating generic pieces of code, you've got to think about those connection points, whether it's a visual component or whether it's just some library functions or a layer in your architecture. Thinking about those connection points makes a big difference to how the code withstands the test of time in terms of maintenance and enhancements and just general durability of the code. So thinking about your component architecture and how you break it down is a really important aspect to consider when thinking about component design with your UX team and UX designers. And events are one mechanism that you can use to make sure you don't too tightly couple the components together. The component itself takes on its own responsibility. The container does not know how to render the component. It delegates that to the component. It just knows, I'm going to put you there and I'm going to tell you to draw on this canvas and show me what you need to show. The container will control the attributes, so potentially with Lightning App Builder, a user will have placed the component on and using the properties pane on the right, set up some configuration for the component. So the container will send those attribute values to the component and it'll customize its behavior in certain ways. Methods and events are other ways in which components can integrate with each other. So that's a very, very high level view of components architecture within Salesforce. And it is a real mindset change for me. We've kind of been used to a world in Salesforce Classic where we're building page-orientated solutions with Visualforce. You've really got to start thinking componentization. It's always been something in the back of our minds that is a good practice, but it's actually really relevant to Lightning and getting the best out of it. So let's drill into that eventing side of things a little bit more, because it's going to become important as we get into Lightning Out. So in Lightning, you define your own event. It's kind of like a message. It's a type of message that you'll send, and it has a name. And inside that, if you imagine it's kind of like an envelope, you might put certain information that gets carried across when that message is sent and delivered and received. So in Lightning, there is a way of describing that, and you just do that with markup. There's actually there's no code involved as such. You just do that with XML. Once you've defined that event, then it's up to you to explain to the container which components actually send that event and which components are able to receive that. So component A in this case registers the fact that, hey, I can publish this event. I'm ready to send that. And it's also responsible for sending that event. There's no point kind of declaring you will, but never do it. And then ultimately, component B and component C can handle that. And component A is completely unaware of who's handling that event. It's kind of just sending that message out there and somebody's receiving that. And that's kind of what Salesforce and the industry at large call the publish-subscribe model. It's kind of not that new. If you look it up, you'll find it on Wikipedia, pub-sub. Sometimes it's abbreviated too. So pub-sub is a real good way of creating decoupled components. It's not to say that you can't create events that are more coupled to your components. So you could create an eventing model between your child components and your parent components that's more explicit. And Salesforce lets you do that. But the only way of creating events that communicate between arbitrary components is to use application events. And that's the event type that we're going to use today. So here's the first look at our address finder component. It's a pretty straightforward component. The objective here is to easily look up an address, and perhaps we don't know maybe we know the contact, but we're not 100% sure which account it belongs to. We're going to start searching for the account, and we'll see this in a live demo in a moment. And then as soon as we see some accounts that match that search string, we'll find the contacts that belong to it, and the user gets to click on that. And that's all that component does. Its sole purpose in life is just to allow you to search, find an account, find the contact you're interested in. There is another component called the address component. Its sole purpose in life is to show an address that it gets received. It doesn't care where the address came from. It just listens for an address being sent on an event and displays it. So that's a good separation of concerns, because when we actually get into the Google Docs example, you'll see that this second part of this scenario is different, but the first part is the same. So we were able to much easily reuse this scenario by decoupling the searching functionality from the displaying functionality. So let's have a look, as promised, at the components running in Lightning Experience, and then we'll get a better feel for what they look like and how they work for when we roll into the actual Lightning Out demo. So I'm feeling particularly not on trend here, not running in the fancy new Winter 17 tabbed orientated Lightning Experience here, but that's due to my org not having been upgraded at this stage. But we still have the regular functionality to edit the home page, and we can see I've got my address component here, which I'm just going to drop over onto there. And I've got my address finder. I'm going to put that above. I'm going to save that page. Go back, and we'll take a look at that functionality. So as I discussed, type in United, and that starts to filter it down. So it's very straightforward implementation. The code for this is shared with this session, so you can take a look at that if you're interested in the detail of how I'm achieving that. And I can then click through the different contacts. And you can see the address below is updating in real time as I'm selecting different contacts. So really, that's the eventing model going on. As I'm clicking through those, there's an event being fired from the address finder component, which is being received by the address component, and it's showing the address that's being displayed. Let's go back to the presentation. So firstly, how many people have actually built Lightning components that they're using inside Lightning Experience the way I've just used it here? Okay, quite a few of you. How many have done the same but in Salesforce One mobile container? Okay. So if you've implemented this interface, the Flexi available for all page types, it already will be available as a candidate to run in Salesforce One mobile. So that's really fulfilling the vision of Aura, which is the base framework Lightning uses to be agnostic of any client. You're able to build it on a component that targets desktop, mobile, and tablet, and many other devices that I'll no doubt start coming our way in the future. So that's a really important interface, the Flexi page available for page types interface. The app hostable interface is really there if you want to put your component on a tab. You can create things called Lightning component tabs. So you just want the whole component on one tab. That's possible as well. So in order to do what I did, just a few brief notes on that. I have to enable my domain. My domain is not only a good idea from a security perspective, but gives you some nice isolation for multiple logins. If, like myself, you've got several logins, you can find yourself inadvertently logging yourself out if you're running multiple tabs. My domain gives you a nice isolated URL for your session, and the sort of problems go away. Obviously, you can mitigate those with multiple browsers, but that's somewhat tedious as well and complex for navigation. So I like my domain for several reasons, not only security, but it adds a bit more reusability from logging in and logging out different orgs. As we've just discussed, there's some new interfaces to implement to get the component to display in Lightning App Builder. If you don't add those interfaces, they won't appear in that sidebar that I added. You can, although I didn't here, add a design resource to give your component. In fact, I did add a design resource to give it a name, a label, so it doesn't show up as address finder without the space in it. It's got nicely text-wise description. And you can also add an SVG resource to give it a little icon as well, so you can give it some branding and better sort of stand out from the rest of the components. So there's a link there that gives you a bit more information about making sure your component's nicely configured for showing up in App Builder. So there is actually another session on Lightning Out, and I chatted with the presenter of that, and we both really found it quite useful that Salesforce chose to do 2 sessions on Lightning Out, because he'd actually chosen to do that on a Node.js or Heroku app, I think. And this one is proving we can do it in Google. But either way, as I said at the beginning, there's many other platforms you can do this on, and I'll go through what the requirements are, because the requirements to run Lightning Out are fairly low, but there are some needs. If you don't fulfill those requirements, you can't use Lightning Out. So all of these things do fulfill those requirements to run Lightning Out on those platforms. So the first requirement is more on the Salesforce side. Your component has to be global. And that global access level means that it's visible, first of all, to tools like Lightning App Builder. Also, developers can use your component if you're delivering your component as a package. And global really starts to come into play mostly when you're packaging things. But if you're delivering that as a package, other developers can use it, which is great because they can create even bigger components that consume your component. It does have some caveats with it in that it will kind of cement the design of that component somewhat, because when you add things into a package that's global, it means that they'll be upgradable in the future, and that does control what you can and can't do to change the behavior or the kind of appearance of the attributes and methods and events. So do make sure you're confident with the design of your component. Obviously, it doesn't mitigate things change, requirements change, you have to deal with that, but global has a very cementing aspect to it. You do have to create a Lightning app. Now, you're not really typically in the mind to create a Lightning app, because really a Lightning app is the container, and we're using Salesforce One Mobile or we're using Lightning Experience, but a lot of the Trailhead or early docs do actually get you creating an app, because it's a very quick way of getting your component up and running, and you get a URL just like a regular page. It's a .app, and if you've ever looked at Lightning Experience, this is one .app. That's because that's the Lightning app for Lightning Experience. So this is an odd thing to create, because we're not actually wanting to create a new container. We want to put our component in another container, but it's what's called a dependency app. It's just helping Lightning know what all the bits are that belong to your solution. Because you don't have a page in Lightning Experience, or you've not built something with Lightning App Builder, it can't kind of figure out what all the bits are that it's going to need to inject into the other site wherever you're putting this new component. So it is a bit of assistance for Salesforce, because they can't kind of figure that out. The code can't figure that out by itself. We'll look at one of those. You do need only your top level components. If you've got multiple child components, the platform will figure out the children that are referenced. You do need to support a script tag. So the script tag in HTML is a way of injecting JavaScript, and Salesforce give you a JavaScript library for Lightning Out. We'll take a look at that, and that allows you to get the Lightning environment up and running in your page, and that's the Lightning Out JS library. Crucially, authentication isn't handled by Lightning Out, so you do need to give it a session or an OAuth token that you've previously established. So do brush up on OAuth. That's the recommended route for logging into Salesforce from other sites and other containers. So let's take a look at Google Apps. What about Google App Add-ons? So essentially, if you've ever used Google Apps, you might have noticed under the Tools menu, there's this script editor thing. And it's actually an IDE. It's a development environment. You run it up and it opens a new tab. You get an editor. And you can edit things called Google App Script, which is, as you might have noticed, JavaScript just rebranded. But it is server-side and client-side. And you can basically configure and customize the Google environment. And you can publish these just like we can as Salesforce developers on their own kind of App Exchange equivalent. You can publish it on the Google App Add-in. And that allows people to go and install that from, it's not shown on this menu, I think it's it's the add-on menu where you can go and browse what's available and install that into your environment, into your document. So once you've actually put an add-on in, it appears under the add-ons menu. In this case, I've got the Lightning Out demo. You can see, for those that are familiar with Lucidchart have created their own plugin, so you can build their diagrams in Google Docs, which is pretty neat. So let's have a demo of that. So I'm not going to go through the login side of things. I previously did that before I started the demo. I'll talk about that later in the presentation about how that works. It's a little kind of clunky UX element to it. But let's repeat the same process that we did in Lightning Experience, but this time I'm not having to go to Lightning Experience and kind of copy, paste this over here, which would have been clunky. If I'm writing a correspondence to that customer, I kind of don't really want to do that. I've come here with the intent to write a document. I don't want to go, well, I now need to go back into Salesforce and find this thing. As useful as these components are on the homepage, I'm still switching contacts. So let's help this user experience by loading that address finder app in the sidebar here. So this is exactly the same component that's running over here. It's completely unaware, there's no custom code in that component, it's exactly the same code. So as a result, I can type unit in there, and it finds United Oil and Gas, and I can see the contacts, and it behaves much like we were seeing earlier. The main difference is we're not seeing the address finder, because in this case, what I want to happen is when I click on a contact, it actually injects it into the document. That's more appropriate for this container. That's what the user experience is that we really want to achieve. So that's essentially the demo for Google App Script, and it proves that you can connect Salesforce, not only a UX perspective and a UI integration, but we're also connecting Salesforce APIs as well. You can use the Google Doc APIs to call back to Salesforce if you wanted to get further information, run queries and that kind of thing. Okay, so this is a diagrammatic view of what we just saw. We saw that the Lightning Address Finder component was hosted in the sidebar for Google Docs, and we fired the address info event. Again, no different from what happened in Lightning Experience. This time, though, the Google App Script code listened to the event. It wasn't the address component that was listening, it was somebody else listening, which is pretty cool. So it means you don't have to be a Lightning component to listen to an event. You can be an arbitrary piece of JavaScript. In this case, an arbitrary piece of Google App Script. Separation of concerns has really come into play here. If we have made a design decision to implement the address view as part of the main component, we maybe would have some duplication here, which would be confusing for the user. If we'd have perhaps chosen to show the address below, they still might have been inclined to copy paste it and put it in, which would have been bad. So it's great that we've made that decision to separate out those two pieces of functionality, because it meant that we could use the appropriate piece of functionality in the appropriate context. So what just happened? So in Google Addins, we'll just flick back to the code. Actually, I'll show you a little bit. That's not occurred to me. It wasn't all that clear on the slides this morning, so I'll just show you what's going on there. So what I did is I ran the script editor from the tools menu, and that opened up this IDE where I can develop my Google App Script. And the first thing you create is sidebar HTML, which is essentially what we're seeing here. It's a HTML file that runs in the sidebar. And that includes some of the bootstrap code that loads Lightning Experience. And I can also see I've got the .gs file, which is Google Script file, with the Google Script code in it. So at a high level, what essentially happens on that HTML file is there is a div which acts as the container for your component. It's just a simple HTML element. You can style it, render it as a box if you want to. But in this case, I haven't styled it, so it's invisible, but it's an actual container that the component runs in. And you have to give it an ID. The next thing, as we discussed earlier, we've got to be able to use that script tag to inject the Lightning Out runtime library. So that's a library that's provided by Salesforce, and I'll show you where to get the link for that shortly. And the very next, the third thing we need to do, in fact I do have a build up here, is to call the lightning.use method. The first thing I do is pass in the name of my Lightning app. So we'll take a quick look at that in a moment, but that's that kind of dependency app that was giving Salesforce that kind of list of all the things we need to make the solution work. And then finally the name of my component. This is component A here, but that would be the address finder component. And also the ID of the container, so that has to match. These two have to match to make sure it injects it into the right way. So if any of you have done quite a bit of internet development, website integration, you'll know that there are security policies in the browser that prevent JavaScript calling out to other domains. So if you were actually to look at what's going on through the developer tools in Chrome in this case, you would see that the HTML file on the left is being served up through from a domain, googleUserContent.com. But yet Salesforce's Lightning component is served up from their own domain, whatever you've called it, Andy's demo domain.lightningforce.com/lightning. So how do we resolve that? Now, thankfully, the wonderful standards committees around the world that govern things like HTML, CSS, and whatnot have come up with CORS, and that's a technology which allows the side on the right to explicitly permit itself to be served up to sites on the left. So that's the way it works. You have to set up CORS on the right-hand side as inside Salesforce to say, yeah, if anybody asks for my content from this location, it's good. Otherwise, if it's any other location, no, I'm not going to allow it. So it punches its way through the security restrictions, but it does it in a way that the owner of that component and consequently the data is aware of and agrees with. So once all of that kind of plumbing is done, then the component appears. It just appears and is injected and is styled by SLDS, so the styling is injected as well already into the container. So that's what cross-site origin resource sharing looks like under the setup menu. You can just go in, and thankfully Salesforce do support wildcards, because in reality my index HTML file wasn't served up from a static URL. It was variable. The first bit of it had some kind of GUID number to it, so we can put a wildcard in there to compensate for that changing aspect of the URL. So once an XHTTP request is made, you can make get, post, update, or patch, the usual sort of HTTP requests, and those can be exchanged back. In the response header, Salesforce will return this to say that it does allow these type of methods to be made from this origin. So Salesforce has confirmed that, yes, I recognize this URL because it matched the pattern here, and you're good to make these methods. So it's an interesting type of technology. When I was researching it, the one thing that probably tripped me up a lot is the direction in which you have to set this up. You kind of think about it in your mind that you have to do something over here to tell this thing to allow you to do something, but that isn't the case. You've got to configure CORS. You've got to configure, apologies for that, you've got to configure CORS on the right-hand side, because that's where the thing is that you're protecting, and CORS will validate the URL incoming and only allow it on the outgoing if it's been set up in Salesforce. So it's a little bit detail on CORS. It's fairly, it's a fairly sort of, once you set it up, you don't need to worry about it. But if you don't set it up, some of the errors are a bit odd. And when you're Googling, you might come across this sort of, where do I set it up thing. So that's kind of what I want to cover that a little bit for you. So as we said earlier, we've got global components. That's the thing to make it visible. We also created that dependency app. So that's in the middle here, and it looks like a regular Lightning app, except that it extends LTNG out app. And it also tells Lightning Out framework that this is the dependency. There is a component here. Because otherwise, when it loaded that app in that JavaScript, it has no idea which of the many components likely sitting in your org are going to be loaded. Now, you could say, well, Salesforce just predict that I'm going to have any of them, but that's likely to cause a bit of a performance problem. So I can definitely see why we have to do a bit of plumbing there to teach Lightning Out about some of the components we're actually going to want to load. So that's our plumbing config. And I thought it'd be interesting to show you the event. The event also needs to be global, and you have to configure the content of the event, which is the address info. So the note that I've made here is actually to bring your attention to a new feature in Winter 17. I've explicitly imported the CSS, the Lightning Design System, which was a static resource in my org, as a dependency, so that my component got styled appropriately. If you actually modify this to say extends force base, then it actually injects the styling. So why didn't I change the sample to show you that in the first place and rather than a comment? Well, the challenge I've got with that, and admittedly I was kind of hoping this wouldn't be as complex at 7 o'clock this morning, but I'll share the problem with you and maybe follow me and see if I can figure out what the solution is. But it extends much like in an object-oriented language. You can only ever extend one thing. So Salesforce have told us we have to extend Lightning Out app. And now they've said, well, if you want the CSS, you have to extend this app as well. So I'm kind of, welcome to anybody that's got any kind of funky ideas of how to do that. But that's a bit of a challenge, really, because I can't do both. So that's why I've actually left the mechanism I've got here. I know it works. That will still work even with this technique. So there's two opportunities to use the styling. So as I saw, you showed briefly in the IDE, you can define a div that contains the Lightning component, inject the script. I did set up the SLDS styling here. So the thing with Salesforce design system is you need the outer tag to have a class of SLDS. Most people, when they inject SLDS, suddenly it's still not styling. The outer tag needs the SLDS. So my index HTML inside Google Docs needed that. And then I loaded my components. So this is an actual example of the code. I loaded the Address Finder app. I created the Address Finder component. And I used something called Event Service to add a handler. And that handler routed to a Google App Script client-side function. I'll show you that in a moment. And ultimately, I needed to pass the OAuth token. There is a library that you can include in your add-in that Google provide to do OAuth. OAuth is an industry standard, so you don't actually need to do anything special to do OAuth with Salesforce. Salesforce comply with the standard. So I was able to, with very little code, get hold of the OAuth token and go through the login process. And I needed to know the URL to my org where things came from, because I needed the my domain there, which is specialized. It's not just na1.salesforce.com. So this is the event handler inside Google App Script. Well, actually, it's a JavaScript method inside the sidebar. And what it's doing is getting the parameters out, the address, and it's calling on line 60 Google script run, because the way Google App Script works is you can't edit the document using client-side JavaScript. You've got to use server-side JavaScript, because essentially Google Docs is a server-side model. It is very client-side, it's very responsive, but everything they're doing, as you'll witness if you're editing a document together with somebody else, is all routed back through the server and updated. So we have to do a little bit of a hop back to the client to update the document and actually paste the content in. So I'll finally show you the fragment of code that pasted that address in. But on the client side, you need to route that back to the server. So there is a caveat around event service, and my insistence that Salesforce disclose this as a public API has increased heading up to Dreamforce practically every hour. I'm making myself very unpopular at the moment. But nonetheless, if you Google for $a.event service, it is quite prevalent out there in the blogs. And Doug Chasman will usually be following such blogs or Stack Exchange posts by reminding people it isn't public. So that is the caveat for this session. Salesforce tell me that they are having active discussions about making it public. I've run this past them. They don't have any major concerns about me saying it, but nor are they being committal about how they're going to make it public. I take from that it's going to be public at some point. Otherwise, they'd have asked me to remove it. There is an alternative if you're at all concerned about you want to go to production. And that alternative is to expose a method on your Lightning component that allows you to express a JavaScript callback of your own. So I could have put on the Address Finder component a method that says set callback, and this code in Google Script could have given a JavaScript function it calls back on. Now, I could have put that into this code, but I'm a bit of a purist. I didn't want anything in my component that was biased to one container, because in Lightning experience, I didn't have to do that. The event just worked. So I'm kind of holding out, being a bit stubborn for the $a event service arriving. So OAuth inside Google App Script. OAuth is supported. The user experience due to the security modeling Google App Script isn't great, but what will actually happen is you'll get a link in the sidebar when they're not logged in. You click that and it'll take you to a new tab in the browser and they'll log in. When they log in, you'll get a message that says, great, you've logged in, go back to the other tab. Now, okay, maybe not a big deal, but I'd really rather have it automatically close the tab and just redirect them back to the add-in. That's kind of due to a security aspect they've built into Google Docs. I've actually started talking to the Google Docs team to see if they'd lift that, because it is a clunky user experience for not just Salesforce OAuth, but any OAuth that's being done inside Google Addins. But it is just that line of code. They provide the library, so if they enhance that or they improve that and you're using this library that's available on GitHub, then you'll be in a good position to take care of any advantage that they deliver to improve that user experience. So as I pointed out earlier, there's a rich set of APIs in Google. So you can, go crazy, put things in spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are a really good kind of possibility for many use cases, actually. Everybody loves the spreadsheets. And on the right-hand side here, you can see the function. This is the server side, so hence it's in the code.js method that actually receives the address and adds it into the document. And of course, it's kind of, it's not that sophisticated, the code, but it does the job. It just adds it as a separate line items. Each of the address line items go into the document. And it's a good example of the Google Docs API. It's pretty straightforward. It's really, as per usual Google, it's a very solid, well-documented API. So, wanted to make a call out for Accessibility Awareness Day. Now, this is actually not today. It was the day that I originally ran this session at London at Salesforce London World Tour. And just a bit of a shout out, I retained it here because when you're thinking about styling your components and building them for modern user experiences, then Salesforce have gone to the trouble of including lots of aspects from technologies such as ARIA that allow assisted technologies, screen readers and things, to interpret your user interfaces, because gone are the days when we would just put a button in an input field. We might be using all sorts of HTML elements to create a button, and it isn't really a button. And those tools need that indicator that it's actually a button. Otherwise, when the screen reader's reading, the person receiving that information is not getting an accurate feel for what's on the screen. So these technologies are well worth investing and understanding in, and making sure the easiest thing you can do is embrace SLDS, because it's handling that for you. Or embrace standard components from the platform, and then you don't need to worry about that. But if you do go custom, think about some of these standards, because they're increasingly more and more important. So some links on resources. The source code for this session is all up here on GitHub. For those of you that are following this session on Chatter, I'll post this as a PDF on the Chatter post. So go to your agenda builder and find the Chatter feed for this, and you'll see all of this. There's a Lightning Components Developers Guide. It's a growing, thick wad of information, but it's a good one to go through. It's well worth the time, because you will bump against things that are well described in here if you don't. And there's the quick start for add-on Google Docs. That took me, when I first learned it, about 15 minutes, and I had an up and running Google Doc add-in. It didn't connect with Salesforce or anything, but I was quite surprised at that. I thought it would be much harder to get something up and running. There's the Google App or script that we talked about. If you're interested in following me, my Twitter handle is Andy in the Cloud. I've got a blog, Andy in the Cloud, as well. It is all IT stuff. Don't share anything about what I ate for breakfast or anything like that, unfortunately. So that remains to close down the session. We've got about 3 minutes for Q&A, and we can take that now if you like. If there's a mic in the middle of the room, if anybody's got any questions. There's one question here. Do you want to go to the mic? And because we are recording the session, it helps if...
So this question is kind of geared towards more the Salesforce platform and how you invoke the APIs. So you talked about the cars. So can we use the same thing to invoke REST APIs by bypassing the Apex?
Yeah. And that's the original use case, actually. Salesforce is just piggybacking off that with the Lightning Out. So cores is exactly the way you'd use to call Salesforce APIs from websites.
So that means that we can build a Lightning component within Salesforce platform, completely bypass Apex, and invoke REST APIs, Salesforce REST APIs directly from the component.
In the component, it could do, but then you're authoring the component inside Salesforce, so your developers would have that level of access. But if you had a website, then you'd need a user that had API access in their profile and their permissions. The component itself only has access to the APIs in Apex, not actually client side. It's a restriction in Lightning components that you can't call the Salesforce's own APIs client side currently.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. 1 minute, 30 seconds of a lady at the back of the room tapping a watch. Okay, and no more questions. Thank you very much for attending. Hope you enjoyed it.